Welcome, everyone, to Oberman Law Firm Podcast. Stuart Oberman here, your host. With us today is Justin Moriconi, our expert and counsel to the firm. Today, we're going to talk about an amazing, fresh off the press topic where the DEA is proposing to drop cannabis from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3. Justin, thanks for joining us today. I know there's a lot to talk about, and I want to hit, maybe a couple topics, and I'll let you expand on that with everything you're seeing. We want to hit, maybe controlled substances, what those are and the ramifications, and what's the timeline? Is it today or is it 6 months or a year? You always follow the money, the taxation,
yeah,
and how that goes into the safer banking. That could change the whole industry, and maybe also the clinical side of this. What's the research? And I know that fresh off the press is the Farm Bill. I'll let you, touch base a little bit on that. And Justin, welcome. Thanks as always. Amazing knowledge, and let's jump right into it. Tell us about the schedules and how we go from a 1 to 3 and what that does to the industry.
For sure, Stuart. Thank you very much. I have to start off by appreciate you having me on. But also, we've been waiting for this moment for many years, right? So it's always been this position that nobody thinks marijuana and cannabis of any kind should be on Schedule 1, right? There's no medical viability and a high rate of abuse. That's what a Schedule 1 drug is. And marijuana really has never really fit into that schedule, right? So there was a large push for many years to reschedule. And last year, the Biden administration asked the Department of Health and Human Services to do a study to see, look, should this be a Schedule 1 or should it be something else? The research end of this has always been, difficult to do because it's a Schedule 1 drug. So finally, after the Health and Human Services came back and recommended that marijuana be changed on the schedule. They didn't say which schedule they necessarily recommended, when it was going to be a 2, 3, 4, 5 or off schedule, right? Non-scheduled. They didn't say that, but we did have some developments. And so we'll touch on it, where the DEA is now they're proposing to reschedule, as Stuart said, and the effect of that is massive. So just very quickly, Stuart, I know you touched on a couple different points. I'll just kick it off by talking about maybe the elephant in the room. And that's the taxes. Yep. These taxes have been making all of these cannabis companies much less profitable or not profitable since their inception. Why is that? Based on a Schedule 1's drug classification, if you are a business,
heroin. I mean, it's Schedule 1's heroin, right? Right,
it's
heroin.
It's heroin dealers. And to rewind very quickly, this IRS section that makes you unable to take the full amount of deductions for your business was really passed in the early 1980s in response to the cocaine epidemic down in
That's 280. That's 280E. Is that right?
That's 280E. That's right. That's the IRS code section that would apply, and it doesn't let these businesses take the full amount of their deductions. They can only take cost of goods sold deductions, right? So our clients are ecstatic about the rescheduling because when it's rescheduled now, they can take all of their business deductions down on the tax side, right? Because it's not Schedule 1. 280E only applied to Schedule 1 and 2. So now it's a 3, and at least it's recommended to become a 3. And so that tax situation is going to be unbelievable. You're going to see profits by cannabis companies go up at least 30% or more across the board, typically across the board. And what's interesting, and we may have touched on this before, Stuart, in some other podcasts, but we have some clients who I guess were kind of figuring that this was coming down the pike, and they stopped paying their what I'll call 280E tax liabilities about a year ago. And so there's a look back period for the IRS, right? They can say, hey, wait a minute. If you never pay, they can look back forever, right? If you pay something, but it's not the right amount, it's usually like a 3 to 5 year look back period.
Right.
So we are, for the next 3 to 5 years, with some of these companies that didn't pay their 280 tax liabilities, now based on the development of Schedule 3, losing 280 tax liabilities 24 forward, the IRS may have a look back period to 2023, 2022 for some of these companies. So if there's companies out there who may have not paid their 280 taxes, we can assist in dealing with those allocations in the IRS, of course.
So if that goes Schedule 3, 280E automatically comes into play.
That's right. So, once Schedule 3 is accepted, and we'll talk about the timeline for that. When's this actually going to happen, right? But once Schedule 3 is actually accepted, 280 no longer applies because it's Schedule 3 now, not Schedule 1 or 2. So it's magnificent. And what's the timeline on this? Yeah.
What is the timeline? You've got the DEA approval, you got federal registers, you've got potential, waiting period on the DEA side, you got 30 days. What's this timeline?
So it's funny, actually, Stuart, believe it or not, we've gone through this before a little bit with the DEA when they decided to open up the research for marijuana over and above University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi was the only institution in the United States that was allowed to research marijuana up until about 4 years ago, from 1972 to 2000 to 2020. And in 2020, the DEA decided that they're going to open this up to allow more companies to apply to the DEA to research the Schedule 1 at that time, right? Schedule 1 status of marijuana. And to do that, they released regulations in the Federal Register. They had a comment period, like they're going to have on these regulations for the new Schedule 3 status. They held a hearing about it, right? They held a hearing 30 days, and then they became final about 30 days after that hearing, right? So we've seen this happen before. And for anybody who's out there who think, well, oh no, now we have a lot of red tape, a lot of hearings, a lot of comment periods. Believe it or not, the DEA, I think, will move expeditiously to get these regulations out and finalized. So in the next 90 days or so, we're expecting to see some regulations published in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register will ask for commentary based on those regulations. There'll be a comment period where you can submit comments, and there'll be a hearing based on the comments and the proposed rules. And
then after the final rule, then there's a 30-day period, and it's off and running. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct. And so these regulations, we're not going to get too far into it on this podcast, but these regulations are going to be like nothing like we've ever seen before, because the information that we're getting is that the regulations will keep the state marijuana programs in place. Meaning, normally, if you have a Schedule 3 drug and you want to sell that drug, it's usually through a pharmacy, and you have to go register to be able to sell that drug, right? So all these programs, right? We have all these states with all these various programs. They're going to have to craft the regulations to keep those programs intact, while at the same time dealing with the Schedule 3 nature of it. It's going to be very, very curious as to whether some of the pharmacies are able to sell the Schedule 3 drug. Now, you're sitting in Georgia, right? So Georgia initially proposed through their state medical marijuana program to sell the product through the pharmacies. And in late 23, the DEA came in and said, oh, no, you're not going to do that, Georgia. Georgia pharmacies aren't allowed to sell a Schedule 1 drug, marijuana, and we're not going to allow the state system to include pharmacies to sell it. However, now that we have a Schedule 3 status and arguably pharmacists can register, that Georgia medical program may be ripe to take off finally, right? It's been stalled for many years.
Now, with this, so how does all this affect the banking side of it? Where now you've got regulatory risk, and you've got the money laundering, and then you've got your customer statutes, and then you've got your FinCEN. You've got a million things. Does this open up the banking side altogether?
I wish it opened it up a little bit more. Bank Secrecy Act, BSA as it's called, and that's where your customer comes from and all of that, has been a thorn in the side of cannabis companies since their inception. The issue becomes still at the Schedule 3 status, it's still an illegal drug to generally sell without the proper federal licensure. So while the change from Schedule 3 by the DEA won't automatically switch the banking availability for these cannabis companies, there is other legislation that is pending that we expect to get more traction on now, including the Safer Banking Act, right? So there was a banking that's been pending now for about 2 years, and it's gone through a couple of iterations in committees on the federal level, and it is meant to streamline and give guidance to the banks about what they need to do to satisfy their Bank Secrecy Act compliance.
That was something we talked about on a prior podcast.
We did. Yeah, we did.
The question next is so you mentioned research earlier. How does this affect the research side, which has daunting federal regulations, on the Institute of drug abuse, and I mean has all these regulatory matters. How will this affect the research side, which could be a game changer?
Yeah, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA. Yeah, that was typically the entity you had to go through on the Schedule 1 status to get those drugs. Now that it's Schedule 3, it's going to be much easier to research, right? So Schedule 3, right? Ketamine, for instance. So we have a number of ketamine clients, right? And what that means is you can, as long as you have the license to use it, okay? So a doctor holds a DEA license, he can get ketamine, you submit standard operating procedures for ketamine, and then you can use ketamine in an off-label use, right? And so that's kind of what
steroids.
Yeah, like so it's the same thing. These are Schedule 3. These are Schedule 3 drugs, right? So in any event, it makes the research a lot easier because the availability, because they don't have to go through NIDA necessarily to get that type of research on a Schedule 3 status. The research based on cannabis is going to be much easier to do, right? And so you don't necessarily need to go through NIDA and the DEA and get your product, right? When you did the research, by the way, you had to get your product from a federal source, right? And so that's why the DEA opened it up for additional growers, manufacturers on the cannabis side back in 2020, right? And so you would have to get your product from those places. Now, arguably, you may be able to get your product from a host of additional sources, right? And so that's just going to open it up significantly and really push the actual medical efficacy of marijuana to the forefront, which is exciting. Yeah.
It's amazing. We're talking about 5 things: with the controlled substance, the timeline, taxation, the banking, the research. I mean, every one of these topics is an hour-long topic, right?
Oh yes.
And these are things that just hopefully the viewers will know about and research and and call about. But there's one other thing that's pending, and I think this may be another day for another podcast. Shortly, is that there's a farm bill pending, which has a little bit of effect. Touch on that a little bit, because I know we want to talk more about that on another podcast.
It is another podcast for sure. Viewers may be familiar with the 2018 Farm Bill, right? That legalized commercial hemp. And its constituent cannabinoids that are naturally occurring within that plant. That industry has matured significantly and is competing with the marijuana industry. So you have basically hemp manufactured products and hemp retail going on, and you also have state programs with marijuana going on. In states that don't have a medical marijuana or an adult use marijuana program, those hemp markets are burgeoning. Wow. And there's really not a lot of impetus on enforcement, right? And so there's a couple different enforcement things that are going on in other states, including in the northeast part of the country. Large part of the southeast and Midwest, you're not getting as much activity on the hemp side of things, enforcement-wise, because of the lack of medical or adult use marijuana.
That's a long topic for another day. Holy cow!
It really is. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add? I mean, it's amazing information. It's just top of mind issues that listeners have to know about and be aware about. Any concluding marks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2 things I just want to talk about. If there's anybody out there, I just mentioned the hemp space. We have a number of clients who, for many years, have been looking at the regulated marijuana space while operating their hemp businesses. And they've always been focused on participating in these new marijuana markets. I would implore anybody who is in the hemp space, is selling hemp manufactured products, to take a serious look at licensure on the marijuana space, because eventually, and we brought this up in other podcasts before, we think the market is eventually going to move to, and it's moving quickly, to a one-stop shop, meaning you're going to go to a cannabis dispensary and you're going to get marijuana products, and you're going to be able to buy also hemp products, and probably a combination of the two. So if there's anybody in the space, It's it's deli style, like we call it, right? The
Wow.
one other point, Stuart, the other thing is just one other thing I hear a lot about, and I've been getting a lot of questions about, is now that this is Schedule 3, can I get this covered through my medical insurance, right? Can my medical insurance cover this? There's a lot of different things going on right there. The short answer is not yet. But there's certain things that insurance companies have to do to get coverage for certain types of drugs and procedures. And this may be one of them.
Wow.
But they have to go through those formal processes before there can be insurance coverage that would be available for medical marijuana.
This sounds like a whole day CE.
Yeah. Well, they give them, and we've given them before, but to be frank, we get a lot better information from serious people in the space calling us up and having frank discussions. And
Well,
we always like to have calls. They are usually not charged, right? So we can take calls, we can field questions to see if this industry in this space is something that you would like to participate in.
yeah, amazing. Justin, you are the resident expert, and we're proud to have you on this podcast. And for our viewers, we're definitely going to be pushing this out pretty quickly. My friend, thank you as always, for joining us. We look forward to scheduling another podcast on that farm bill, because that's running pretty quickly. Look forward to it, Stuart. Thank you very much, man.
All right, buddy. Thank you.